Hello, welcome to today's class. Today we'll be talking about companies, and to better understand this, at the end of this, I hope we should bear in mind, at the back of our head, we should have something to think about, like, okay, so what are the differences that exist between a public and private limited company, and some of the features that make you identify to say, okay, what is happening here is actually a private limited company, and what is happening there is actually a public limited company. So let's start with turning from the top. What is a company? A company is an organization that is owned and controlled by two or more private individuals. Okay, and the only way an ordinary person will gain ownership to a private company or public company is by buying shares into that company. So they are owned and controlled by private individuals, but they will allow members of the public to buy shares from them. So now let's start with a private limited company. With any company that you need to form, I think we did talk about this before we closed. Say for any company to exist, you need at least two forms that need to be submitted with the registrar of companies, which is a memorandum of association and an article of association. If at all you've forgotten about what we discussed, you can check the link pop up there. Okay. So now, private limited company. A private limited company is an organization or business organization that is owned and controlled by two or more private individuals. So roughly the maximum goes up to 50, but for some countries it might go up to 200 members. Okay, so these individuals privately sell their shares without advertising to the general public. Okay, so if at all you want to become a member of a private limited company, that means that the members that already have shares will sit down and discuss whether they can sell shares to you or not. Okay, so usually the advertisement is sort of like just going to be secret without too many people knowing about it. So they usually sell their shares to their close friends or family members. Okay, so now what actually makes up a private limited company? What makes up a private limited company is that, one, first of all, it is its own separate legal entity. That means that with a private limited company, the owners and the company itself are classified as two separate individuals. Therefore, in a case where, let's say, one of the owners steals from his own company, the company will have the right to take that owner to court to retrieve that money that belongs to the company, and vice versa. Okay, so now, in line with it having separate legal existence, that means that the owners of the company also have limited liability. That is, I guess, where the name limited companies comes from. Okay, so that means that the owners are only going to lose up to the capital invested into that company should it be liquidated or should it be wound up. When a company comes to an end and assets have to be sold and the money divided among its creditors and owners, the creditors cannot go and get personal property that belongs to the owners because the company has failed to pay. The owners are only liable up to the capital they've invested. If they have bought shares worth 50,000 kwacha, that means that is the amount that they will lose should the company be liquidated. Okay, another feature that makes up a private limited company is that most of the times a private limited company will always end with the letters LTD or PVT. So whenever you see a company that has the letters at the end of its name, LTD, limited company, or private limited company, PVT, that means that that company is a private limited company. Okay, another feature of private limited companies is that it faces what is known as double taxation. That means that since the owners and the company are sort of like treated as separate individuals, therefore even when the company makes a profit, it will first of all has to be deducted from the company profits. The profit which the company has made has to be taxed separately, and the profit which the individuals have also made, which is known as dividends, have to be also taxed separately. So that is what we call double taxation, and this obviously also applies to public limited company. So the operation of most of the private limited companies is usually medium to large scale operations, as well as it has an certainty of continuity. That means that it cannot easily be wound up or sort of like brought to an end. Even if one member dies, the company will still continue existing. Okay. Alright, so now we come to a public limited company, and usually people confuse a public limited company with a public corporation. The two are very different. A public corporation is under public sector, which is owned and controlled by government, but a public limited company is a privately owned organization, okay, which allows members of the public to buy its shares using the stock market. In Zambia, we have the Lusaka Stock Exchange. In the United States, they have
how are you, sir?
Fine, how are you?
Fine, I was looking for the interest for giving out homework and this office.
For which grades?
Grade 11.
Wasn't that like last week, Wednesday?
No, they called me Friday last week, but I came out late. I found that number.
Oh, I think there should be a madam in there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. How was that? Thoughts I didn't got. Anyway, let's take it from the show. Okay. With the public limited company, this is not to be confused with public corporations. Public corporations are owned and controlled by government, and they fall under public sector organizations. But for a public limited company, it is a private sector organization. It's under private sector. That means it's owned and controlled by private individuals like you and I. So how do we become part of this private sector organization known as a public limited company? Some of the features of a public limited company is that it usually sells its shares to the general public. That means that anyone is free to buy shares into a company. These books of accounts will usually be advertised to the members of the general public through public media like newspapers or television. Okay, so the books of accounts are not kept secret at the end of the year. Whatever profits or losses and assets which the company has will be advertised in the tabloids. It usually sells its shares through the stock market. Okay, in Zambia we have the Lusaka Stock Exchange. In London they have the London stock market. In the United States you have Wall Street. All those the stock markets where people can sell and buy shares from into these multinational companies. Okay, so now Just like a private limited company, a public limited company will also have separate legal existence. That means that it cannot be categorized as one entity together with the owners. They are separate. Once certificate of incorporation has been issued, that means the owner and the company itself are now treated as two separate individuals. Okay? Therefore, the owner can sue the company and the company can sue the owner in case of any misunderstanding. And creditors cannot claim any debt from the owners which the company has borrowed, and vice versa. Okay, so now, just like private limited companies, public limited companies also have limited liability. That means that since the owners and the company itself are treated as two separate individuals, even when it comes to borrowing, if a company borrows and fails to pay, the owners of the company will only lose up to the amount that they've invested into the company through buying of those shares. They would not be subjected to losing their personal property because the company has borrowed and failed to pay. No, the two will be treated as separate, and therefore, whenever the company borrows, it is borrowing its own capacity and not the capacity of the owner. Okay. The scale of operation for a public limited company is usually large. Okay, and usually there's even a fixed minimum amount of capital that a public limited can start with. Okay, so this capital reserve needs to be made before the company can start operation, and these are usually large scale operations. Companies like ShopRite, companies like Glencoe, the ones that own some of the mines that we have in Zambia. Companies like Mopani, those are public limited companies, and they're multinational companies because they're found in many countries. Okay, there are a lot of examples. Zanaco, is a public limited company. If you watch the BBC news, you notice to say all those companies that whenever they list companies that are listed in the Lusaka stock market, and there'll be a line of prices for their shares that will be passing at the bottom of the screen. That is if you still watch the BBC. But yeah, all those companies that will be listed there are public limited companies. They are listed on the Lusaka stock market. Okay, so those are some of the things that you need to look out for when you're talking about private and public limited companies. Obviously, from the general description of these companies, you're able to tell to say public limited companies usually each one of them will have their own advantage, and most of the advantages are similar because these companies are similar in operation. Okay, for a public limited company, for it to issue before it can issue shares to the general public, it will need to issue what is known as a prospectus. And the prospectus is simply an advertisement of the number of shares the company is selling, the price of those shares, and any other relevant information about the company members of the public would need to know before they can actually buy into that company. Okay, so it will need to issue this to the general members of the public for them to read through and see whether they are willing or they're interested to buy into the values of that company. Okay, so what are some of the differences between a private limited company and a public limited company? So, for a private limited company, usually when it comes to the ownership, it has a minimum of 2 owners, 2 shareholders, up to a maximum of 50 shareholders. While just with a public limited company, it has a minimum number of shareholders of 7, and the maximum is unlimited, so you can have millions of shareholders into the company. Okay. Two, the other difference that the amount of investment, the capital raised through selling of shares for a private limited company is not as large as compared to a public limited company, since they have unlimited number of shareholders that can invest into a company as long as they have the shares. So that means they are able to raise more capital as compared to private limited companies. Private limited companies only sells shares to individuals privately without necessarily advertising to the general public, whereas public limited companies will sell shares to members of the general public. So anyone is free to buy shares into public limited companies. Another difference is that with a private limited company, once the certificate of incorporation has been issued, they can then even automatically start trading. Whereas for a public limited company, they will need to issue a prospectus so that members of the general public can then buy shares and raise the necessary capital before they can start operation. So those are some of the differences that you find, not to mean that those are the only differences, but I'm assuming as the notes come in, you will be able to add your own differences to what I've just mentioned. Okay, so having said too much about the features, and usually advantages and disadvantages will come from the features and the similarities that we just talked about. Bear in mind to say of both companies, they will have boards of directors. They will not be sort of like the company and its owners will not sort of like take a direct sort of like influence or impact on the day-to-day running of the business. So the board of directors is there to make policies which the company will follow. Then the management, which is usually headed by the general manager or the managing director, are the ones that are in charge of the day-to-day running of the organization. So each company that you come across will have either a managing director, chief executive officer, or a general manager who is in charge of executing the vision of the board of directors. And usually for a public limited company, the board of directors is elected from amongst the shareholders, and obviously there will be different shares that are issued for different situations. And usually the people that hold special shares, or we call them ordinary shares, are the ones that are entitled to be elected to become boards of directors through obviously an annual general meeting. And for a private limited company, the board of directors will mean that probably if like the less than 50, all the shareholders will become members of the board of directors, and those are the ones that will elect an individual now to run the management. So the management is separated from the boards of directors, and usually the management is the one that is in charge of executing the vision of the board of directors, and the job of the board of directors is simply to come up with policy and direction of where they want the company to go. Okay, so before a public limited company can start operating, they will need to issue what is known as a prospectus. So a prospectus is simply an advertisement that is issued to invite members of the general public to invest into the company. So the prospectus will contain things like the type of shares that are being sold, the number of those shares, and the price at which those shares are going to be bought. It also contains information about the past performance of the company as well as the future prospects of the company, and any other relevant information that is required for investors to take keen interest into the company will be advertised in what is known as a prospectus. So it will be there to attract potential investors into the company by the promoters, who are the ones that issue the prospectus. Okay, so hopefully with all these things that we've talked about, people are able to confidently come up with the advantages as well as the disadvantages of each type of company. Until we meet next time, good day.